Hi, all. Please join me in welcoming Greg Foss. Greg is a senior threat researcher at VMware Carbon Black. His talk, The Future of Destructive Malware, will discuss the history, trends, and advancements of physically destructive malware. Thanks. It's all yours, Greg.
All right. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. I'm excited to join you all here in this kind of dystopian reality that we find ourselves in, presenting from our homes. But I'm really glad to be here. Especially with the Boulder community, since this is my home, my backyard. So super excited for this, and just honored to be able to present today. So let me share my screen here, and we will jump right in. All right. I think my stuff's up. So, I want to start things off by I really like what Erica mentioned today, talking about fear, and the other F word that she didn't linger on a whole lot is failure. Is something that I want to address before I jump into this talk, because it's something that when I first submitted to B-Sides Boulder, I had a completely different talk. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a whole different ballgame than what I was planning to talk about when I initially submitted this talk. We were initially looking at, what we were seeing in terms of like APT attackers and more like advanced adversaries and government kind of nation state sponsored side of things. That was our real focus area at the time. But, into the post-COVID era has really changed perspective for us a lot. And it's caused me to look at a whole different side of things in a different way, because it's been evolving. And what I want to talk to you about now is actually ransomware. And ransomware, I think, is kind of one of the most critically destructive attacks that we're seeing now today. Across our data set, just from what we've been able to prevent on the endpoint in the beginning of 2020 to the current date, we've seen a 900% increase in overall ransomware attacks. So it's a massive problem. And, the reason I want to touch on this is more than likely everyone here that's attending this conference is going to be affected by ransomware, much more so than any type of advanced persistent threat sort of adversary. It's just very common, and they're getting very good, and they're changing their tactics with how they're targeting businesses. And that's kind of what I want to dive into today. It's kind of how they've evolved their tactics. Now, one interesting thing, looking at just the distribution across industry vertical of ransomware itself, just from our data sets, and this is from 2019. We haven't run this in 2020 yet. But essentially what we saw towards the end of 2019 was a big, significant targeting towards energy and utilities. And shortly thereafter was government. And, now coming into the election, that I feel like this is going to be a significant target for general e-crime and ransomware in general, and nation state adversaries, looking at, swaying opinions, swaying polls possibly. Who knows, right? I mean, we're in literally twilight zone in a lot of ways, as a community and as a country and as the world right now. So it's real interesting times. But the key here is these e-crime groups are taking significant advantage of a lot of these situations right now. The old saying is never let a good crisis go to waste. And that is no different when we look at these e-crime groups. And what's interesting now is a lot of them have shifted to actually moving operations online. A lot of groups that were traditionally doing more in-person sort of scams and things like that now have opened up a new avenue into doing online sort of attacks and e-crime related activity. And I'll get into kind of why that's possible and how that's being done. So to highlight this, I want to take a step back, and we're going to look at this actually from the attacker's point of view. Now, this is a pretty interesting diagram that Evan Anderson, Ian Lee from Randori, and myself put together for a different talk. But essentially, it summarizes kind of what we're seeing in terms of ransomware and e-crime actors and evolving and how they're attacking organizations. So what we're looking at here is our black box, typically like a company that, say, this group wants to target. And we have our happy little attacker over here. Now, first thing they're going to do is some open source intelligence gathering on the organization. They're going to go find out your geolocation, your employee footprint, your public IP address space, social media, all this other kind of good stuff that's out there about your company, so they can figure out, possibly high level how they're going to attack you. Then it's going to lead into a reconnaissance phase. Now, a lot of traditional ransomware, what we saw was much more just fire and forget sort of phishing emails and, hoping about 10% of those stick and then unleash the ransomware. What we're seeing now is a shift towards a lot more manual hands-on keyboard approach towards the initial access into these organizations. So, they're going to do some scanning against your edge devices here. So we'll pretend this is like an organization's DMZ, if you will. And so now they kind of have an understanding of what your public footprint is. And from that, they can take an educated guess at what the rest of your organization may look like on the inside. And now, due to COVID, I put some outside, home workers here, because that's kind of a new avenue for them, even though I would argue that it's existed for the past decade, but now is only just really getting the visibility it deserves. But so the next thing they're going to do is ongoing monitoring of specific assets and understanding, what is something that might actually have vulnerabilities in it? Can we watch this and wait for a new vulnerability to be released or be discovered, and then exploit it at that time? Now, most commonly what we're seeing is these guys going after VPN concentrators or publicly exposed Windows and Linux servers, specifically looking at just people throwing Windows servers out with remote desktop protocol open without multi-factor enabled. I mean, that is, I would say like 90% of the incidents that we get roped into start with some sort of situation that way. It's either going to be that or more likely a phishing email. But it really depends on the group and what's going to be the path of least resistance into this organization. So of course, they could go after this home user. They could target a home router. They could do it through phishing. There's a lot of different ways they could target someone personally and then use their corporate access to ride back into the organization. But what we're going to look at from this standpoint is kind of what I just talked about in terms of the most common way they're getting in, and that's going to be taking over a Windows server that's in the DMZ. Now, first and foremost, they're almost always going to have this callback to a second server from the one that they did the scanning from. So they're not going to have this go back to the server that you probably already have in your logs and already are at least tracking it to some extent because they've been scanning you. So they don't want to continue using that box. They're going to have this callback to a second server where they're going to conduct their primary operations from. Now, once they gain access, they're going to do this initial reconnaissance, start understanding the internal mappings of the organization. Usually this is going to be done passively, trying to not directly scan and stuff like that. They're going to look to gather credentials and figure out how they can move from the DMZ to the internal network, assuming this isn't just a flat network like a majority of companies on the planet. So, there's a lot of different ways they could target a user and get a credential. Oftentimes, these are just going to be in memory on this box already. So as long as they can elevate their privileges, they can dump those credentials from LSAS or various other techniques to pull those credentials. Needless to say, once they have those, they're going to begin probing from the DMZ to the internal workings of the network. Now, this is a key point here, because this is going to be a way you can actually detect some of this activity. Like, why would you see any authentication activity originating from these internet-facing servers to your internal network? One, and also, are there failed authentication attempts? And are there multiple failed authentication attempts? This is going to be a good indicator to go off of to see if someone is trying to worm their way into your organization. Now, eventually, they are going to be able to find servers where these credentials work, and they are going to be able to pivot and begin to move laterally and start to identify high-value assets. So over here, I just made a mock little backup server. Now, nowadays, there's a lot of better backup solutions that actually avert some of these problems. But if you're still just, saving your system images off and saving files off to just a random server, that's going to be a prime location for them to target, and not just target for access, but they're often, what we're seeing is setting up redundant access from these backup servers. And now this redundant access is going to be something that isn't calling back at the same frequency of their primary server here. It's going to be that foot in the door where they're basically leaving this access so that in case you find out about this, they're going to be able to get back in through another way that you may not know about. And this is probably going to call back out, maybe once a week, once a month, or something like that. So it's going to be very low and slow, something you're going to be much less likely to notice and catch on to. And the reason for that is they need to maintain their access for as long as possible so that they can identify high value assets and figure out the most optimal way to encrypt the environment. Now, over here, we have our file share, which I'm just making it easy for this example, but we'll assume this is where this company has all their important stuff, right? So oftentimes this process here, the internal mapping and identifying key assets, some groups, some ransomware groups will actually take months of doing this mapping and understanding of the environment before they actually start figuring out how to exfiltrate this data. Now, some of them will start doing this immediately. They'll use all sorts of different tricks to get this out of the environment. One of the ones we've seen recently is leveraging OwnCloud, using their own installation of OwnCloud, installing this on a user's system, and then just syncing files to it, and then offloading this to another server, which is usually going to be a compromised website, like a WordPress site or IIS or something like that. And then they're going to offload these files through this user. Now, that's just one way. Some of these groups are very verbose with it. A lot of them will just use FTP. So you can see a lot of this data traversing outside of your network, which is another area where you want to have that visibility to understand, is anyone syncing a ton of data out of our company? Is this crossing our boundary at somewhere where we can actually inspect that traffic? You want to make sure you have this layered visibility across your whole infrastructure, and especially the ability to understand what's happening on these remote users' systems. Now, the second most common way we're seeing this exfiltration happen is over DNS. DNS is something where I'm still surprised so many organizations don't have DNS logging, essentially, as a core tenet of their security program as a whole, because it's so important. Especially when you're looking at this type of activity here. One way you can find this is often you'll see one system within your environment making thousands of requests to a single parent domain with multiple varying subdomains. So that's one way you can detect this. But either way, you want to have that network visibility so you can catch this, before they're actually able to get this out of your environment, or at a minimum, halt them, in this process. Because if they get your files and your most sensitive data out of the organization, now it's fair game for them. They're going to profit off of your environment no matter what you do. Oftentimes, this data will be put in their marketplaces. It'll be hosted on their own servers, which we'll be showing you in a little bit here. But all these organizations now, it's moved to double ransom or double extortion, where essentially, they don't care even if you aren't going to pay for them actually encrypting the environment. They're going to profit off of selling your data, sharing your data, using this data, all sorts of different means to leverage this information that's been stolen from your environment to make money regardless of if you pay them for decrypting your environment or even if you're able to restore from backups. One trick with the backups we've seen is some of these groups will infect the system images directly so that, when you're restoring data or when you're restoring from backups, you're restoring their malware again. So they'll still be in your environment even after you go through this restoration process. But, let's just play the victim here, right? So we have our victim. They've realized what's happened now that their whole environment is utterly destroyed and encrypted. Now they have to figure out how they can communicate with this threat actor, which, now thanks to new advancements, if you will, I guess, in our US Department of Justice, this could actually be illegal for them to pay. So, there's a whole other layer of complexity added on to just this simple process right here. But we'll pretend it's olden days and they can pay and actually get a key that works, and they're able to use this to decrypt their environment. So now they start recovering their data. They're to a point where they're kind of feel better about things. They've gone through this horrible situation, and now they're not happy, but they're somewhat relieved. But the problem is a lot of these things that are overlooked is going to be this residual access. And this is just that initial backdoor that may have not even been discovered during this initial attack. Now, also the malware itself, especially if they've been able to deploy it in the backups and it's synced across systems, is going to be able to call back as well. So this attacker can still maintain access to the network, and then they can launch the second and third stages of their attacks, which could be, selling access into this organization. It could be reselling data so other people can get into it. There's a lot of things that can happen from this right here. So that persistence is just such a very significant component of this. And to highlight this, we actually went through all of the ransomware that we saw over 2019. And this is actually a chart that Andrew Costas, one of our threat researchers, put together when he was basically mapping ransomware behaviors to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And what was really cool about this, and also kind of scary, was he was just looking at the ransomware payloads themselves, let alone the actors behind them, which now we're seeing much more hands-on keyboard, actual manual penetration and monitoring of these environments once they're inside. But what you can see over here, these are all the different ransomware variants, and then these are the different MITRE TIDs as they relate to persistence. So you can see there's tons of overlap here. And the commonality is that a majority of these ransomware payloads will leverage persistence mechanisms directly within the payload itself. Oftentimes leveraging rootkit functionality, such as modifying the master boot record. They'll create scheduled tasks, modify the registry, modify startup items. And almost all of them use hidden files and directories to some extent, both in execution and in their persistence mechanisms. So it's a very key component of ransomware that they want to make sure they're sticky and they stay in the environment. And oftentimes these redundant kind of accesses are not even going to leverage the original binaries that you may know about. They could be using PowerShell. They could be using various scripts. So you really have to do full incident investigation if you're hit by ransomware and treat it as an advanced adversary, not just some commodity kind of script kiddie or something like that we might have viewed it as in the past. Additionally, in terms of on top of persistence, the majority of ransomware does credential access. And this is oftentimes for them to elevate their privileges, or they will also use this in larger operations such as credential stuffing. So they will take credentials from browsers. Almost all variants we looked at have done this, where if you're saving any of your creds within your browser, you need to stop immediately and wipe all of that content because it is trivial to pull that content out of your browser. Use a password manager of some kind because that adds at least an additional layer for them to get through to do this. Because tons of malware, not even just ransomware, does this sort of activity. So it's something very important to pay attention to and be aware of. They will also target other applications that are going to be more esoteric across more of your general kind of user population. But they can use these for various other means as they relate to their overall attack. Going after Telegram, looking for FTP credentials, other credentials to your websites, your online accounts, your bank accounts, all sorts of stuff like that is going to be a target for these groups because at the end of the day, all they care about is making money from these intrusions. So you really have to keep that in mind when you're looking into these is, what is the profit angle for this actor in obtaining this information? And, that'll help you frame kind of how the attack might flow from that point forward. You also have to assume that they're monitoring your keystrokes, they're monitoring your clipboard, doing all these kind of traditional attacks to gather credentials and just simply monitor and, also see if you are onto them as well. But the final one I want to touch on, there's a lot more we could get into, but collection is something that is built into a lot of these ransomware families. They will try and pull a lot of local data from the system. They'll do this automatically, oftentimes using PowerShell. And what this data will be used for is often going to be leveraged in their marketplaces for how they can resell data, and oftentimes reselling direct access to systems as well. So, as you can see, these are just some examples of some of the data that they collect. But in general, every single ransomware variant we looked at is doing some form of at least collecting data and leveraging this data to perform further actions from their malware payloads. Now, taking a high-level look at all of this, we mapped out everything from 2019 across the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So this is the big project that Andrew Costas put together. And what was really neat about this is just to see, all of these techniques kind of stacked in how ransomware actually acts, and all these unique components that are associated with ransomware that people don't necessarily think of. So many folks focus on just this impact side of ransomware, the encryption, inhibiting system recovery, destroying data, all of that kind of stuff. But really, there's a ton more going on here with ransomware in general that makes it a much more concerning sort of piece of malware than what it kind of is viewed as on the surface. So really have to look into all of these different kind of components, and that's what's great about MITRE, because it gives us sort of a ruler for us to kind of measure against and understand, what are the tactics that we need to be most concerned with as defenders. Something at Carbon Black that's immensely valuable to us, because we can take this information and we can use it to build better telemetry, better rules, and overall help secure our customers much better from the myriad of these types of techniques that are leveraged across ransomware and various other types of attacks. But without getting too much into the detail of ransomware itself, I want to take a look at the other side of this, the actual underground economy and what happens behind the scenes with your data and with your information once it's stolen by these adversaries. The thing that's been eye-opening to me, we've been spending a lot of time looking at these marketplaces and looking at these the kind of a whole underground economy at scale of what's happening here. And what's amazing to me is it's very much an industrialization that we're seeing with e-crime now, where they're making it very easy for people to get in on the ground floor and perform some of these attacks without having necessarily the skills that you used to have to pull off some of these very large and prominent attacks. It also makes attribution insanely difficult, which is one of the reasons that we at Carbon Black don't focus a whole lot on attribution. We focus more on the munitions themselves and understanding, how do we build the best detections possible for these techniques, not so much caring about whether it's a fancy bear or pinchy spider or any of that kind of stuff. Although that does play into it, but when you look at the e-crime groups and how they're sharing information and resources and infrastructure, it changes our view significantly on, just the overall kind of attribution as a whole. So the big change we've seen with ransomware this year has been this double extortion kind of component. Is popularized by the Maze cartel in terms of, trying to profit off of the stolen data, in addition to the encrypting the organization's environment. It's really made ransomware a more significant threat, because for a while, all these companies would say, hey, I have better backups now, I can restore, I've tested, I've done all this good stuff. But really, it's shifted to a point where, cool, you paid them for the encryption. Now what are you going to do about the stolen data? Because not only are they going to extort you for this data, but they're going to share all this information within their inner circles. This information is your entire Active Directory environment, all users, all encrypted credentials, all that good stuff. Any browser credentials they've stolen from your employees, any customer lists, any information related to your customers, especially looking at how these groups have targeted healthcare organizations lately, is significantly concerning. Because this is kind of escalating this threat to a point of, how do you respond to this? Even if you pay them for both of the problems here, you're still at significant risk for years to come from all of the data that's been collected and what they're doing with that data on the back end. So Maze Cartel, they're the only one that I'm actually going to show their URL, and I think they've actually moved this to just Tor now. But they were very brazen. Like every single quote unquote client you see over here was a different victim of them. And you can go through their site. Basically, every single day, they're posting new information about new companies that have been breached by them and are now being actively extorted. So basically, like, you'll have the company name, article about the company, they'll link to news articles, and they actually reference them as their clients. Over here, you can actually access the full dumps of their data, so you can gain access to a lot of very sensitive information very easily here. Now, often they don't show all of this. They will post it, and then you have to pay for a key to decrypt it, or you have to know somebody to get the decryption keys. Some of them, they'll just post it and share it openly because they want to embarrass the company. But either way, there's tons of information out here that significantly exacerbates the risk of what these actors are doing and how they're actually targeting organizations, and kind of just highlights the punitive nature that these groups are taking. Now, Maze is a significant group, and the reason I brought them up first is, they're the group that kind of coined this sort of trend. They were the first group publicly, or at least they're attributed with being the group that has leveraged double extortion and started teaching other groups to do the same. And now they're actually partnering up with other ransomware groups. So Ragnar Locker was another significant group, and now they have partnered up with Maze. And I believe last week we saw the first attack from their combined efforts, where they actually used Ragnar Locker's virtual machine method of deploying a whole virtual machine to the host, and then it deployed Maze ransomware from within the virtual machine. So that was one of the defense evasion kind of mechanisms that they use. And so now these groups are starting to partner up and share information, share infrastructure, share intelligence and techniques. They're becoming extremely powerful, and all the more powerful in that they actually are looking to partner with additional organizations now. And Maze, the reason I call them a cartel is because they call themselves a cartel. It's believed they have well over 100 members within the Maze cartel. So it is a significant group, and very, very dangerous group of people, honestly. But they're not the only ones. Nephilim is another very popular ransomware group. They run a website called Corporate Leaks. Same sort of thing as what we saw in Maze. They're dumping the data. They're asking for you'd either pay to decrypt the content, or eventually they release it for free. Either way, it's a significant black eye to these organizations that end up on these sites. R-Evil, or Soda no Kibi, is another very prominent ransomware double extortion group. And one of the things I found interesting, they run a website called The Happy Blog. And over here, I wanted to just highlight this one company because it gives you some insight into what they actually do when they're in these organizations. And this one's a good example because it's public, and so it's easy to talk about. But as you can see here, they're saying for over a month, the structure of the corporation's work, user services, and cloud data storages were examined. And 1 terabyte of confidential data was copied as a result. And then they list some of the data that they've exfiltrated. So as you can see, this isn't just like a fire and forget. They didn't send some phishing email and just wait and let it automatically go run and do its thing. This was literally them in the organization mapping them out as an advanced adversary for a long period of time before unleashing their ransomware payload. Paisa, or otherwise known as Mespinoza, these guys, they actually have, I got to give them credit, they have a pretty fancy site. It looks like an old Commodore 64 kind of terminal. And Paisa stands for Protect Your System, Amigo. And these guys, they do have a pretty good sense of humor, although they are definitely criminals. They take the approach that their partners are making this data available to you, and they actually give little advertisements for their partners and the like. So it's kind of an interesting site to go through. But same sort of thing, this is where they're posting all the stolen data and looking at the double extortion of their victims. Clop is a kind of, I guess, lesser known one, I would say. But same sort of thing, they run a blog, they have news releases, they have the leaks published, they have all sorts of information here. One thing I did highlight on this slide is down at the bottom here, they are one of the groups that has kind of banded together in this sort of consortium of ransomware actors that has said they will not attack hospitals, they won't attack orphanages, nursing homes, charitable foundations, and the like. So, that is good. There is some honor among thieves, but not all groups follow this, right? As we've seen recently with Ryuk, just recently attacking UHS, they were one of the groups that outwardly and publicly went against that and said, we don't give a fuck. We're attacking everybody with impunity. And that means they're going to pay because they're much more significant targets. And so, as we've seen, they just orchestrated arguably one of the largest ransomware attacks we've ever seen against the healthcare industry in the midst of a pandemic. So they don't care at all. But fortunately, a lot of these groups actually are not following that lead, which is somewhat good, I guess. Doppelpaymer, very similar, very popular ransomware group. They run another data leak site. And as you can see here, they're tracking the views. There's a lot of people that actually come across this content that is stolen from these organizations, which is significant, kind of highlights, the brand reputation damage and related, kind of blast or damage from the blast radius from these attacks that you can have just by how many people will have access to this information once they decide to post it. Secondment is another very similar group, similar kind of way, and they actually run their site on the ClearNet as well. So this is one where you can just go to their website and view the contents, which is why I think they have arguably much higher number of views for a lot of their content. As you can see, this one, there's 28,000 views of this stolen data from an insurance company. Now, a lot of this is going to be bots and stuff like that, scraping the data and whatnot. But still, this is a lot of information that's very sensitive to these companies that is now out there and in the open. Now, Conti is a super interesting one. This one was actually initially discovered by Brian Baskin, which is one of our threat researchers at Carbon Black. And what's interesting kind of come out of discussions around Conti is they are saying this might actually be the next iteration of Ryuk. So we'll see, what comes out in terms of the UHS breach. If any of their data actually ends up on here, then we'll know it was actually Conti. But that is kind of the big difference, right? Ryuk does not participate in double extortion, or at least not as far as we know. But Conti definitely does, and they run a website called Conti News. They have their press releases, all that good stuff. And this one is a little lesser known, I would say, but they definitely still post all the stolen data about the organizations they've breached. Suncrypt is another one that is rather new, newer to the double extortion game. But same sort of thing, encrypting organizations and posting their data online. Now, there's various other groups that don't have their own websites, but they use various e-crime forums and hacker forums, such as XSS and Exploit and the RAID forums. And essentially, these are more going to be individual actors. And this is getting more into the environment of the individuals that are paying for access to ransomware as a service and leveraging credential stuffing tools, or purchasing access from initial access brokers, which we'll get into in a couple slides. But essentially, kind of their next stage of where this information goes is going to be leveraged in credential stuffing and trying to pivot using this existing data that they have. So credential stuffing, they're going to take all of this sensitive data, all these credentials and everything, and they're going to throw it into some actual commercial grade tools that allow them to test these credentials across a large number of websites and different services, which is kind of how they often will hop to their next target. Is it's usually going to be an opportunistic sort of thing. So any of these companies that are breached and they're related to or tied to any of these other companies become significant targets for them. And one of the things we've seen, a way for them to actually do this more manually And actually, pretty creatively is by conversation hijacking. And so what that is they will get into your email and they will go dig up old historical conversations. And then, with a outside company, so say you're a law firm and you're doing work with some, X company or something like that, they'll rekindle these old conversations that you've had in the past. And they will start getting them talking to the point where they will actually share something with them, usually a macro-enabled document or something like that, so they can leverage your partnership and your relationship with this other organization to gain access to that organization's infrastructure. And now we're actually seeing them use Slack internally, especially for organizations that have much more granular segmentation between hosts. They can leverage Slack as a form of pivoting. So they can start these conversations and send payloads and trick people essentially in order to gain access to other hosts within the network. So they're really taking a lot more time and effort to figure out how to move around within these companies and leverage the companies that they've already compromised to gain access to additional organizations' infrastructures. Now, some of the tools that are leveraged for credential stuffing are actually pretty impressive. We were looking into a bunch of these that are available on crimeware forums. And this is from a report that Digital Shadows put together earlier this year, where they were talking about credential stuffing at large scale. And they mapped out the conversations revolving around the top most popular credential stuffing tools. And so over here, number one is a tool called OpenBullet, which is very easy to use. You pretty much plug in your list of credentials and it'll go shoot it out at whatever sites you aim to have it try them on. Now, this one, the number two, Centrimbot, is super interesting because it's one of the ones that actually uses image recognition within the tool itself to solve CAPTCHAs for you. So pretty unique approach, and it works on the simpler CAPTCHAs, not so much the click the fire hydrants and buses and all that kind of stuff. But this one is a super interesting one. In terms of just having, this kind of technology like built into tools that are just leveraged for credential stuffing and not even made publicly available. These are all commercial grade tools that are available on hacking forums. Now, we won't get into these other ones, but they're all kind of pretty similar. Just to show you what some of these look like, over here we're looking at OpenBullet, and down here is Sniper. But same sort of thing, you just check all the boxes here for every site that you want to try these credentials for. They also handle multi-factor in certain ways. There's ways in these crimeware forums where they actually talk about how you can get people's tokens and stuff from SMS, multi-factor push requests and the like. So it gets pretty interesting the further you dig into this. But one thing I did want to highlight on OpenBullet here is just built into the tool, you can configure proxies. So you can push all of this through Tor. You can do it in more of an anonymous kind of fashion. A lot of these will also help you solve CAPTCHAs. Over here, it tracks if the site you're trying on has CAPTCHAs enabled. And if so, they have various means to allow you to automatically solve those. And then for some of the more intricate logins, they actually have Selenium integration. So you can use the automated browser kind of approach to test these credentials across these various sites. Now, solving CAPTCHAs in and of itself is super interesting. For the trickier ones, like reCAPTCHA and the ones that actually take a little more effort to solve, you can actually outsource these. So there's various services such as 2CAPTCHA, XEvil, 9KW, and image typers. And what these do is actually offload the CAPTCHA to people in other countries for pennies on the dollar. They will go and solve these CAPTCHAs for you and then send the code back to you so you can submit the request. And there's various ways to tie these into scripts, tie these into the tools that I just highlighted. To allow you to automate even when these organizations are using CAPTCHAs across these various forms. Now, on the open source side, the more legit side, there's a really neat tool called Credover by DaVinci that's pretty awesome. It goes and actually you can plug in a list and it'll go check it against public breaches. And this one's pretty quick and fast, and it's one of the only ones I would actually use on an asset that's not a VM. The other ones I would not really trust because of where they come from and the groups that are putting them out. But this one is definitely a good one for you to just understand your organization's threat posture and know, if they got access to X credential, what else might they be able to get into with those credentials? This is just a quick and easy way to test that, but realistically, you have to take a significant look at the whole breach in and of itself when you're looking at the organizations, behind some of these significant attacks and what they're actually going to do with this data on the back end. Which gets us into access mining, or essentially the direct resale of access into organizations. So this is a technique that's actually been around for quite some time. It's very prevalent with just leveraging compromised assets for proxies, dating back to about 2008. Mostly what we saw with this type of attacks and initial access brokers in general was selling access to single assets, such as compromised home, personal Windows computers, and things of that nature. But what we're seeing now is a significant trend shifting to compromising of an organization itself, and then mapping out that organization, understanding the potential value, and then placing that dollar value on just direct access into this organization, and then posting this information for sale online. And oftentimes the way they sell this is usually just going to be through direct RDP account that they've stolen, or they've cracked, or they've otherwise figured out. Sometimes they will have backdoors deployed. Sometimes they'll have remote access Trojans. Really depends on the target and the actor who's initially gained access to this company. But most of these are going to be organizations that don't have multi-factor enabled, and it's just going to be, here's the RDP creds, you have domain admin, go nuts. And so they'll sell these from anywhere from around $1,000 for some small companies to upwards of some of these organizations we've seen go for over $500,000. Most notably, one incident I'll talk about in a couple slides here. But the thing that's concerning with this is it really lowers that bar to entry. So you don't have to have this experience in gaining initial access to companies in order to gain access to some very high value assets in some very significant organizations. Now, just taking a look at exploit.in, this is on their community kind of just main forum website here. But under buying and selling, you can see that direct access is one of the top items on their marketplace. So it's one of the hottest commodities right now, something that's going for a significantly high dollar value and is being sold regularly and consistently in these markets. And so this is something that is significantly picking up steam. Every time we check on this, we're seeing additional new vendors joining this marketplace and adding new and more high value assets. To highlight what some of these look like, this is from Russian Crimeware Forum. But this one is someone selling access to quote unquote government center USA. Now, if you start chatting with these people, you'll find out more about where this is, where they're located, what type of government center this is, and other kind of interesting things like that. But as you can see, they're selling this for around $30,000 at the current price of Bitcoin. And the way they do this actually to create sort of trust within these trustless markets is through escrow. Now, I don't know if any of you have kind of messed around on some of these marketplaces, but escrow is a means of the marketplace has essentially a wallet that you can put this money into to prove that you have the money to pay for this good or service. The seller can go verify that, and it creates this mutual trust, and they can essentially provide this access. And once you're both agreed that this is what you paid for, the marketplace releases the funds to the seller through escrow, and everyone's happy. And now this person can go in and use their ransomware as a service that they just bought from the same marketplace to encrypt this environment without having any clue of what they're actually doing. And it's very common. This is another access to a government institution within the US, and they got in through VPN, and then they have RDP. And they give you pretty good understanding of, what the organization is, what you'll be buying. And, if you reach out to them, you can find out all the details of what they're actually selling on this specific market. So it's very common. This is something that, all day, every day, they're posting new direct access into organizations. Over here, some of them will do blanket posts like this, domain admin into a Saudi Arabian hospital, domain admin into a USA government network in Connecticut. So this person has multiple networks for sale at the same time. And often, if these organizations are implementing multi-factor, they will give you instructions for how to get around the controls that they have implemented. So it's pretty much like leaving it. There's no guessing. It's very easy to use and very easy into some significant organizations just by crawling these forums and being willing to put up money to gain access. Now, just how successful are some of these groups? This is a guy who he actually just recently was arrested. So that's the only reason we're listing his name here. But Andrei Turchin of Kazakhstan, he also goes by the name The Invisible God. His main alias is FXMSP. Now, if that sounds familiar, you may have read the article about this guy as hacking 3 prominent antivirus vendors within the US and selling access to their source code. He sold their source code directly, and he sold direct access into these companies. That was his thing. He was a initial access broker. And just to give you an idea of the scope of this, he had victims in 135 different companies across 44 different countries. And it's estimated that he's made at least $1.5 million. And just in July of this year, he was arrested and charged with computer fraud, wire fraud, and related hacking crimes. And the only reason he got caught was because he went after the antivirus vendors. It was too big of a story, too much publicity. So it was something where, he couldn't just, pull off this attack and keep hiding like he'd done with a lot of these other organizations. That one was the one that did him in. He went after a group that actually had the means to track him and was pissed enough to really want to follow this thing to a close to the initial person who'd breached their perimeter to begin with. So taking it to the next stage, looking at these marketplaces, that's essentially where a lot of these transactions happen. It's a central and quote unquote kind of trusted location for these groups and individuals to share and trade and sell all of this stolen information and access, and find new partners to work with, and figure out how they can expand their overall operations. What's interesting to me about this is we've seen a significant shift from a lot of these groups moving from the darknet to just clearnet websites. A lot of these you don't need Tor or ITP to access anymore. You can just access them directly. A lot of these actually have the escrow solutions built in. I would actually say pretty much all of them that are successful do. And then some of these actually include full chat and email support type solutions. And some actually go through full third parties to do this. It's run like a legit full business, essentially. And the key to all of this is building up reputation across these platforms, because all of these groups that are operating in these forums have to have a level of reputation associated with their accounts in order for anyone to take them seriously and for them to do any sort of business with them. And now, we were just looking at, exploit.in and XSS and some of the more public ones, but some of the interesting ones are sites like Russian Market, which are essentially websites that specialize in just selling direct access to specific data. And it's more like a traditional marketplace, if you will. So once you log in here, you're presented with all these various options for what you can buy here. First up, what we're looking at is just direct access to single systems. And as you can see here, they have the country listed where they're located, the first couple octets of their IP address, the ISP that they're using, what type of operating system. And they also list if they have admin access to these hosts. And they have the different vendors that post the data here. But essentially, these ones are going for pretty cheap. If you just want to buy access to a single asset and use that for whatever you want, really, I mean, it's only $5 to purchase access to a lot of these systems. And so that was RDP. They have SSH as well. Same sort of thing. SSH is a lot cheaper. As you can see, like $1, 90 cents, 80 cents for access to these various Linux boxes. Now, what's more interesting, I think, is these Stealer logs. So this is going to be a lot of people that have access to web logs and related logs within organizations where they actually have the visibility to view encrypted traffic, or they view people accessing certain services, and they actually sell the logs directly. And what's funny is you can hover over these and it'll tell you, do they have the logins, do they have passwords, they have cookies, all sorts of information that could be very useful for an attacker to gain access to bank accounts, to social media accounts, and various other websites and things like that. And these are going for around $7 or so a pop. So pretty good deal for what you're getting here. Of course, they have the credit card dumps. These are going to vary in price based on, what you're actually gaining access to with these cards, how much money is on it, where they're located, the type of card, all that good stuff. And additionally, I don't think I included a screenshot, but they sell PayPal accounts as well. Same sort of thing, and relatively cheap to gain access to a lot of this information. Now, Russian market is only one of these many markets of this type that are out there. Another one's UAS, or Ultimate Anonymity Services. They are selling, the same sort of thing, direct access to individual assets. Over here, about $10, $18, and so forth. So interesting thing with UAS is they actually sell social security numbers as well. You usually have to get these in like bulk, or you have to kind of guess and hunt around to find what you're looking for, but pretty cheap, right? Someone's identity, and oftentimes this will include their email and sometimes passwords to their email account for around $2. So pretty cheap to gain access to a lot of interesting and sensitive information on individuals. Now, a lot of these are going to be private marketplaces that you can't even buy access into. You have to basically make friends somehow, or you have to figure out bypasses in their website, which I'm not going to tell you which ones we did for this, but essentially over here you can see you can buy a remote desktop protocol in bulk, pretty cheap again. Often organized by ISP. You can do bulk orders by country, by ISP. The list goes on. But really, what I just wanted to highlight with all of this is there's a lot of these vendors out there offering this data. And additionally, there's a lot of customers looking for this data. So this guy, Amadeus Mozart, I guess is his name, he buys RDP servers for Encrypt. So basically, purchase access and then goes and encrypts these assets. And looking at the various countries, it's different dollar values depending on the countries where these assets are located. USA going for the highest dollar value. But essentially, there's this whole ecosystem where criminals are providing this data, and there's a market for it. There's a significant market for it. Now, the last piece of this is really going to be how they get their money out. And that comes down to money laundering. Essentially, what we're looking at here is various usage of privacy coins. Traditionally, what we saw was Monero being used more heavily than anything else out there, just because of its privacy focus. But now there are tools out there that actually say they can trace through these transactions and trace through, Monero as well. So they could actually come to find, where this money is going. So these groups are now moving to Haven protocol more and more because it's very similar to Monero, but has additional privacy mechanisms built into it to help kind of hide their money. Now, almost all of this money goes through cryptocurrency tumblers of some kind. So that's a big thing that's difficult for law enforcement. Is how do they actually trace these transactions through tumblers, through changing of privacy coins, and all of these various components. So really what they're looking at, and the way a lot of these guys get caught, is when they're taking this money out and actually converting to cash. That's usually where the law enforcement will actually be able to step in and catch these guys. So a lot of them are keeping their money tied up in these various privacy coins for quite some time. So I mean, at the end of the day, these e-crime groups are really going to leverage any and all means at their disposal to profit from any of these breaches in multiple different ways. Ransomware as a service, we didn't even really touch on that, the marketplaces around that. But that is a significantly growing market that makes it very easy for people to get in on this and profit from these breaches. I would say the combination of these two things right here is really lowered the bar to entry and made it easy for people that don't have necessarily the complex skills required to pull off some of these attacks to get in and execute some significantly damaging attacks. And this complicates attribution. There's all sorts of components tied in here with code reuse, shared infrastructure, pivoting between organizations, selling access, buying access, all these kind of components that make it difficult to really put a name and put an actor behind these things. Of course, we can say, we know who created this, we know who created this component, but who executed the attack? It's very difficult now just due to how much this is complicated by all of these different kind of components. So really, high level, you want to deploy endpoint protection, segment as much as possible, and ensure that you have that layered visibility into what's happening within your organization. And, understand and be aware that these attackers will compromise third-party and adjacent targets in order to come after your organization directly. And even though you can negotiate with these people and, oftentimes get the prices down on your ransoms and stuff like that, you should never fully trust them and take the mindset of, they probably still are in the environment. And, we need to basically look through this in full detail to understand what they actually did from beginning to end. And so that's why we always recommend people involve an incident response firm when hit by ransomware, because it's a much more complex attack, I think, than a lot of people give them credit for. So it is something that's really changed significantly in terms of post-COVID times as well. And so with that, I think we might have some time for questions. But if not, you can definitely reach me at my email or on Twitter, and I'll be in the Discord for the rest of the day as well. With that, thank you all very much.
Cool, thanks, Greg. We can try and do a question really quick. We just want to finish up at 12:30 for a lunch break. See, there's a question from Spike. We see a lot, probably the majority of malware now profiles the system on which it's running, and most often will halt operation on VMs with identifiable things like the VMware drivers or VMware tools installed on the system. So the question is VMware going to address this problem by giving users the ability to randomize or modify the driver/file/registry associated with these drivers so that they can't as easily be profiled?
That is a great question. That's something I hope that we will do. Coming from the Carbon Black side, I don't have purview into our VMware kind of ecosystem as much as I would like just yet. But it is something, we can always take this feedback back to them and say, here's what we're seeing. because you're right, that is exactly what they're doing. It's a great way for them to understand what systems they're on. What are they in a sandbox? Are they in what type of environment, and figuring that out. So that is something I think would be very beneficial to add. We'll see. VMware is a big company, and Carbon Black is a small fish in this big pond. So I don't know how much say we even have over these type of things.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thank you for answering the question. All right, well, I guess we're going to break for lunch. We'll be back at 1:30 with the next session. And Discord will be going on, so please feel free to hang out and talk. See you all in about an hour. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. See ya.